In our last lecture, we discussed how competing worldviews lead different observers to come to radically different conclusions based on the same objective data, and then introduced the concept of the tragedy of the commons, the individually rational but collectively irrational overuse of a common pool resource. In this brief lecture, we will discuss different paths to preventing tragedies of the commons and managing common pool resources. The most common approaches to managing common pool resources are 1. The establishment of access restrictions and usage fees, 2. A resort to hierarchy and centralized control, and finally 3. Co-management among users or stakeholders. Common pool resources provide value to users. For most private goods that are both excludable and rival, their value is established through pricing mechanisms. Users can then make individual decisions based on their means and desires about how much of a good they wish to consume or make use of, because the user internalizes both the costs and the benefits. That is, they receive all of the costs and they receive all of the benefits. Now, you do this all the time. So one group of solutions is an attempt to restrict access through usage fees or some other pricing mechanism to essentially make access to the resource a private good. If the problem is overgrazing on commonly held pasture, why not just parcel it out into smaller pieces of land? Individual herders may have incentives to graze more cattle on commonly held land because they internalize all of the benefit but pay only a fraction of the social cost. But only a fool would overgraze their own pasture. They would still receive the benefit, but they would also pay all of the cost associated with degrading the resource. This solution, privatization and market pricing, runs into a couple of problems. First, many common pool resources are simply not excludable, or at least not excludable at a practical cost. It's one thing to restrict use of a small private lake for fishing. It's another entirely to restrict the use of Lake Michigan, to say nothing of the Atlantic Ocean. The second, however, is more fundamental. Who is it who does the restricting? Turning the common pool resource into private property presumes that the private property rights are enforceable, that there is some recognized authority that will pay the cost of enforcing those rights. Let's say you're in West Texas in the early 19th century, sparsely populated and with the nearest semblance of law and order several days' ride away. You own a ranch. One day, you see someone grazing a new herd of cattle show up on your land. What do? There's a reason the term frontier justice exists. In the absence of recognized authorities, you either enforce it yourself through a negotiation, threats, or a gunfight, or it doesn't get enforced. This is one of the reasons the Old West was an almost hilariously violent place. Outside of towns, and frequently inside of towns, private property was secured through direct private action. As the saying went, God made men, but Samuel Colt made them even. People had to be willing to threaten or use violence at a moment's notice. It was Hobbes' state of nature, albeit with more mustaches and cheap whiskey. And as we'll see in future lectures, this is essentially the situation that exists in areas of limited governance in the present day. For example, cattle raiding and land use conflicts between herding communities occur all across the African Sahel, an area very weakly penetrated by African states. This brings us to the second way of managing common pool resources, a resort to hierarchy and third-party enforcement. Let's take that same West Texas scenario, but add in a third party, a Texas Ranger. In that case, you don't have to threaten violence. You get the law involved, and they enforce those property or usage rights for you. By hierarchy here, I mean that competing claims on the resource are not adjudicated by the disputants themselves, but rather by a third party both recognized as having legitimate authority over them. Think about common pool resources like inland lakes and parks. Who enforces rules associated with their use? The state, or that entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. States provide a variety of services in exchange for revenue in the form of taxation. One of the main services is adjudicating disputes. This is what civil court proceedings are for, and enforcing property rights. The state internalizes or pays the cost of enforcement, but generates benefits and revenue from doing so. And it uses its monopoly of force to get users to comply with the rules and prevent free riding, or the usage of the resource without paying for it. For many common pool resources, and definitely for public goods like national security, those payments are indirect and come in the form of taxation. This is Hobbes' Leviathan. But states aren't the only third-party enforcers who adjudicate and enforce rights. If you've seen The Godfather, you know it opens with Marlon Brando's Don Corleone solving people's disputes and offering protection and enforcement. This is the real business of organized crime, adjudicating disputes and policing illicit markets, such as those for drugs, prostitution, and illegal gambling. The third way is collective co-management in the absence of hierarchy. Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize for demonstrating that, under certain conditions, communities can effectively regulate their own common pool resources in ways that promote the long-term health of the resource without having to resort to central enforcement.
Common pool resources are is a very general term to refer to a wide diversity of resources in the world where it's hard to exclude people from them, but once they are in and if they use or harvest, what they harvest takes away from others. So an easy example is to think of a fishery. It's hard to get a boundary on a fishery, so it's hard to exclude people. But if I take out a ton of fish, those ton of fish are not available to other fishermen. Well, the public good and the common pool resource share the difficulty of exclusion. Having peace and security in your neighborhood, you can't exclude anyone from enjoying it, but any one person does not subtract from peace and security. So it's this difference between subtractability or not. I'm not arguing that centralization or privatization will sometimes work. I'm arguing that they are not the only solutions of successful systems, and that many times individuals come together and create a common property regime that they understand, but not necessarily others from the outside, and that many common property regimes are also successful. It is hard to come with a common set of rules that is negotiated person to person or through various ways at a global level. But we can be working on local rules that work very well.
That is, the community as a whole pays the cost of enforcing usage rights based on the principle of shared stewardship of the resource. And what exactly are those conditions? Ostrom actually laid out 8, but 6 of them are really the most important ones. The first is that the resource and user groups are clearly defined. That is, members know that they are part of the group and what the group is about, such as fishers with access to a bay or farmers managing an irrigation system. And they need to perceive themselves as having a long-term stake with the resource. They would behave quite differently if they were just passing through than if they're putting down roots in the community and intend to use the resource for many generations to come. The second is that collective choice arrangements allow most resource appropriators to participate in the decision-making process. That is, group members had to agree upon decisions so nobody could be bossed around. 3. Effective monitoring by monitors who are part of or accountable to the appropriators, so that disruptive, self-serving behaviors like overharvesting could be detected and punished. 4. A scale of graduated sanctions for resource appropriators who violate the rules. These could range from informal sanctions, like gossip and public disapproval, to larger ones, like not allowing offenders' children to marry into the community or complete ostracism. 5. Mechanisms of conflict resolution that are cheap, fair, and easy to access, meaning that group members would not have incentives to take matters into their own hands. And finally, 6. Self-determination of the community recognized by higher-level authorities, or simply that the group has the elbow room to manage their own affairs. This last point is crucial because while states are often seen as the logical adjudicators of environmental conflicts, they can also be a cause of those conflicts by disrupting the ability of communities or sets of communities to run their own affairs and adjudicate their own disputes. As we'll see in future lectures, these same principles are important in the design of international institutions, which are mechanisms for coordination and dispute resolution created by actors, states, that are at least formally equals as sovereign authorities. Over the rest of the course, we will return frequently to these different approaches to managing common pool resources. For the moment, however, there are 3 main takeaways. First, managing the commons requires someone, be it the state, tribal elders, or the community itself, to pay the cost of establishing and enforcing usage rights. Second, this is often done through hierarchy and third-party enforcement, but not always. And third, the nature of the resource itself matters. The biggest problems in governing commons arise in systems like the global atmosphere or the oceans, where the user groups are enormous, complex, and rife with competing interests. Ostrom's theory may work well in explaining how a village can govern a commonly held pasture. Whether it works at the scale of Earth's atmosphere is a completely different question. Corleone? Corleone? I can never remember.